Hey everyone, welcome to the next episode of How to Play Warhammer 40K 7th edition. As always, my name is Jay, and in this episode I will be going over the shooting phase. So now that we've already gone over the movement phase, we've gone over the weapon profiles, it's now the time to go over the shooting phase in great detail. And this is the part of the game where your models shoot your opponent's models, hopefully do some damage before the assault phase. And as I said, depending on the type of model that you're using, the unit type, infantry, beasts, jump infantry, and the type of gun, assault, heavy, rapid fire, you've already made your decision on how to move and what you want to shoot in this phase. So let's just go over the shooting phase in some good detail and then follow it up with an example, tying it all together. The first part in the shooting phase in Warhammer 40K 7th edition is to choose one of your units. If it's your shooting phase, you get to choose which of your units will be firing in the order in which you want them to fire. So you choose a specific unit on the table. Next, you choose one of your opponent's units that you want to shoot at in this phase. Another important thing is when deciding who's shooting at who is range and line of sight. To be able to fire a gun, a model needs range, so it has to be able to fire at an opponent and be able to reach them with the gun using the range from the weapon profile. And line of sight. It needs to be able to see at least one member of the squad in the opposition squad. If a member of your squad is either out of range or cannot see any member of the squad being fired at, it cannot fire its weapon in this particular shooting phase. Now typically, all the members of the squad will get to fire at the same target as each other unless the squad has a rule called split fire. Split fire allows one member of the squad to not fire if they don't want at that same squad, and they can choose to fire at a different target. Typically this applies to guys with a better gun, and they may want to shoot at something, maybe instead of shooting at a squad, they want to shoot at a vehicle or a building. That way you can fire two different targets in the same shooting phase after declaring it. However, in this particular case, you have to declare that the primary amount of the squad is firing at the primary target and who is split firing at a different target, and you name that target as well. Once again, that individual split firing has to be able to have range and line of sight to the squad that he is shooting at, or the unit that he is shooting at. Now, how do you determine line of sight? Line of sight can be tricky. Basically, if you lined up your head with the eyes of the model being shooting, can that model see a member of the squad that squad is being fired at? If so, they can fire at them. And if not, they can't. And if the squad is out of range, tough luck. Now, there can be a situation where you can see a model, but that model is out of range. And the models you can't see are within range. In that particular case, you cannot fire because it has to be a model that you can see and a model within range. So unless you can see the model and it's within range of the gun, you cannot fire this particular turn. Now, it's always a good idea, because you can pre-measure anything in Warhammer 40K, is to pre-measure the distance to ensure that the gun's range is okay for shooting that squad. Because if they're out of range, you've wasted a firing attempt. And you can pre-measure everything so you can know exactly what models are in range of your opponent's models before choosing them as a target. Also, it's always a great idea that if there's any obscurity in the rules, always to clarify with your opponent. For example, if you think the models might be getting cover, always ask your opponent what they feel about the situation and agree before firing, because that will resolve the situation later when rolling saves and one of you is surprised about what the other one believes. So now you've chosen which squad will be firing at which squad of your opponents. Now you choose which weapon will be fired. And basically you fire all of that weapon at a time. Now, for most squads, this is just one weapon in the squad. You fire all those weapons at your opponent and see what happens. However, some squads, for example, this Dark Angel Tactical Marine squad, as you can see here, has a combination of bolters and a plasma gun is in the middle of the squad. So if I was to choose this squad of Dark Angels is going to fire at that squad of Orc Boys, I first have to choose, will they fire the bolters first or the plasma guns first? Typically, people choose the closer gun to fire first. Because if you choose the farther gun and you end up killing the closer members of the squad, the gun with a shorter range may not be able to fire in that phase. Now once again, if you're curious about the range of the gun or the type of the gun that you're going to be firing, please check the weapon profile. And the previous episode of this series covers weapon profiles in great length and detail. So now that you've chosen which squad will fire at which squad of your opponents and which weapon, now it's time to actually do the shooting. Now, depending on how many guns you have in the squad and how many shots per gun, you roll a number of dice. So for example, these bolters, if there's 5 members in the squad and 4 of them have bolters, they're rapid firing, so that is 4 times 2 shots. So you get to roll 8 dice. But how do you know what dice roll you need to actually result in a hit? It's pretty simple. In this particular phase, you require the ballistic skill of the model firing from your squad. The ballistic skill is found in his stats profile under BS. Now these Space Marines are ballistic skill 4. And what you need is your ballistic skill plus the dice have to be equal to or greater than the number 7. That's the easiest way to remember it. So, if you have ballistic skill 4, like these tactical Marines, you need to roll a 3 or greater on your dice to result in a hit. Anything less than a 3, a 2, or a 1 does not result in a hit and is called a miss. Now it should be noted that in Warhammer 40K 7th edition, a roll of a 1, so if you roll a dice and it results in a 1 is an automatic miss regardless of the ballistic skill of the model firing the gun. Now, I know what you're thinking. What if the ballistic skill of the individual is higher than 5? Because then 6 plus 1 would result in 7. So what typically happens in this situation is that if your ballistic skill is higher than 5, so between 6 and 10, if you fail to hit on the first roll by rolling a 1, you get a second roll. So essentially for the first roll, you use the first 5 points of your ballistic skill. So if your ballistic skill is 6, you would use 5 of those 6 points for the first roll, so you need a 2 or higher to result in a hit, because 5 plus 2 is 7. However, you get to use the remaining amount of your ballistic skill for the re-roll. So if your ballistic skill is 6, you still have 1 point left of ballistic skill that you have not used, so you get to use that 1 for the next roll, so you need to roll a 6 on the re-roll to end up with a hit, because 1 plus 6 is 7. So, for the ultimate example, for guys like Cypher here, he has a ballistic skill value of 10. So he gets to use 5 points for the first roll. So if he rolls a dice on a 2-up, it results in a hit. On a 1, it's a miss. But he still has 5 points of ballistic skill left. So he can use those for a re-roll. So on the re-roll, it's also a 2-up to result in a hit. And that's basically how you fire weapons. You just roll the number of dice equal to the number of shots being fired. You add the dice to the ballistic skill values of those firing, and if it's greater to or equal to 7, it results in a hit. If it's a 1, it's automatically a miss, regardless of the ballistic skill of the firer. And that is how you decide how many hits you get. Now that we've covered how to actually hit, I should cover a situation called snap firing. Now, snap firing applies in certain situations. For example, if you move with a heavy weapon, you are typically snap firing during that phase, unless you have a rule called relentless. Basically, snap firing means for that particular turn, you are ballistic skill 1. So as you need to add your ballistic skill to the dice to equal a 7 or greater, you need to roll a 6 or better when you roll on your hit rolls in order to get a hit. And that is snap firing basically in a nutshell. So the next part is rolling to wound. So you take the number of dice equal to the number of hits that just happened, and you roll them again to see if any of those hits resulted in an actual wound for your opponent's models. Now for this particular case, the 2 important variables that you have to remember are the strength of your gun and the toughness of your opponent's models. And essentially you compare them to determine what you need to roll on these dice in order to result in a wound on those opponent's models. Now sometimes in Warhammer 40K, you can have models with different toughness values in the same squad. For example, this war boss attached to that squad of boys, he has a different toughness value than the boys. The boys are toughness 4, the war boss is toughness 5. But in this particular case, you are basing your value off the majority of the squad. So since the majority of these boys is toughness 4, the war boss is toughness 5, but you kind of ignore that for the purposes of to wound. You just go on the majority toughness of the squad. So if the strength of your gun is equal to the toughness of your opponent, then you need to roll a 4 or greater on a dice to result in a wound. If the strength is higher on your gun than the toughness of your opponent, it's easier to wound. So if the strength value of my gun is 1 higher than the toughness value of your opponent, you need a 3 or greater to result in a wound. If the strength of my gun is 2 or higher, so it is at least 2 points higher than the opponent's toughness, it needs a 2+ to wound. In a similar way to the hit rolls, a to wound roll of 1 is always a no wound. It does not result in a wound. The best thing you need is a 2 up, which, as I said, is in this case, is if the strength of your weapon is at least 2 points higher than the toughness value of your opponent. Now, if the strength value of your gun is lower than the toughness value of your opponent, it's harder to wound. So if the strength of your gun is 1 less than the toughness value of your opponent, you need a 5 on a dice, a 5 or 6, to wound your opponent. And if the strength value of your gun is equal to 2 points or 3 points lower on your gun than the toughness value of your opponent, you need a 6 up to wound. So what happens if the toughness value of your opponent is 3 or more points higher than the strength of your gun? Basically, you can't wound them because you can't roll better than, essentially need like a 7 up, and you can't roll a 7 on a d6. So for example, if those Space Marines are firing their bolters, which are strength 4, at this Wraith Knight, who is toughness 8, since 8 is 4 points higher than their bolters, they can't wound them. So they can't shoot their bolters at the Wraith Knight because they can't wound it. So essentially, the strength of the gun can potentially wound anything lower than it in toughness and up to 2 points higher than it in toughness. So these bolters, which are strength 4, can wound toughness 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. They cannot wound toughness 7 or anything higher than toughness 7 because you only wound up to 2 points higher than the strength of your gun. So these are important things that you must consider when determining your target in Warhammer 40K 7th edition. So, now that you've determined what you need to wound your opponent, you roll those dice again from the hits, and you determine which ones actually result in wounds. And those dice are collectively called a wound pool. Now, sometimes the dice can have special rules. For example, rending. Rending's only on a 6. So what you do is you would separate those 6s that you rolled on the to wound rolls from the rest of the ones resulting in wounds, because those 6s have different special rules than the ones without the 6. And they would be put into their own wound pool. Basically, a wound pool is a collection of wounds that have the exact same characteristics and the same special rules from each other. So now that you've created your wound pool, it's now time to allocate those wounds to the opponents. And this brings us to the next part of the shooting phase, which are the saving throws. Now typically there are 3 types of potential saving throws that your opponent can have. The first one is armor saves, and these are by far the most common saves in Warhammer 40K 7th edition. The second most common are cover saves, which are basically saves created by the environment around the individual, and maybe the bullet was skimming by and hit a piece of terrain instead of the model. The final one is called invulnerable saves. Invulnerable saves are typically given to a model by its war gear. For example, Terminator armor, like this Deathwing Terminator, automatically gives a 5-up invulnerable save. Other ways of getting invulnerable saves include psychic powers, or can be given using very special rules in the game, such as some terrain pieces have the ability to give an invulnerable save to those inside it. So, the next part of the shooting phase basically means that you have to figure out what potential saves does the model have access to, compare them, and typically the model takes the best one available to it. There are some situations where they may choose to take a suboptimal one, maybe to prevent special rules from being affected, but typically they would just take the best one that applies to it. So, as I mentioned, the first save is called the armor save, and it is the armor save of the model in its profile. For example, the Space Marines have a 3+ armor save. The Orc Boys have a 6+ armor save. So they need to roll a 6 up on their armor save to be alive. Now the first thing you have to do is compare the AP value of the gun being fired to the armor save of the individuals being fired at. If the AP value is equal to or less than the armor save of the individuals being fired at, they do not get an armor save during this shooting round. For example, the bolters being fired at these Orc Boys from the Space Marines would be AP 5. 5 is equal to or less than their armor save value of 6. Therefore, the Orc Boys would not get an armor save against these Space Marines. But if we reverse the roles and the Orcs are shooting at the Space Marines, their guns are also AP 5, and the Space Marines' armor value is 3 up. So 5 in this case is not equal to or less than the armor value of the Space Marines, so the Space Marines would still get their armor saves against the Orc shooting. The second type of save, that as I mentioned, is called the cover save, and it's typically created by the terrain around the individuals or maybe they're in. Now, typically an individual would get a cover save if at least 25% of that model being shot at is hidden from line of sight from the squad firing at them. And this is typically done by terrain. Could be around a wall, could be in a crater, could be in ruins, could be in a forest. And if 25% of that model is obscured by some piece of terrain or something around them, they would get a 5+ cover save, meaning that on their saving throws, they would need at least a 5 to stay alive. Now, some pieces of terrain don't have a 5+. For example, ruins, like these ruins you can see here, actually have a 4+ cover save. So if a model is in those ruins and is fired at from a squad, they would actually receive a 4+ cover save. This crater, however, would only have a 6+ cover save because it's only really tinily obscuring the model being shot at. The final potential save that a model may have is called the invulnerable save, which, as I mentioned, is typically given as a result of war gear or like armor. For example, this storm shield on this model gives him a 3+ invulnerable save. So no matter what's firing at him, he gets at worst a 3+ save. However, most models don't have access to invulnerable saves. Most models rely on armor saves or cover saves. Very few have access to invulnerable saves relative to the other two types of saves. So it's by far the least used type of save in Warhammer 40K 7th edition. So as I mentioned, the key is now to go through each step and determine whether or not they actually receive a save of that type. So the first type, armor save. Is the AP equal to or less than their armor value? If so, they don't get an armor save. If they do, they get an armor save. Cover. Are the models in cover? Are they at least obscured from line of sight from your models? If so, they would get a cover save. If not, no cover. Also, there are types of guns that I will mention that have ignore cover special rule, which basically means that if these guns are being used, the models cannot use a cover save from that shooting. These typically involve flamers or blast weapons that have ignores cover. And the final one, invulnerable save. Do they have invulnerable saves? It's usually like in their war gear, you know ahead of time. This one is indisputable. It's just in the war gear, or is the model equipped with something that would give them an invulnerable save? If so, they have an invulnerable save. If not, they don't have an invulnerable save. And then you compare these three values, if they exist, and see which one is the best save. And typically the models will receive that save. I will be going over this in a greater example in just a moment. The final question that people tend to ask is, which models are shot at first in a squad? Which models do you remove as they die in a squad? And the answer is quite simply, the closest. So, if the Space Marines are firing at these Orc Boys, the very first Orc Boy to die would be the one that's closest to the closest member of the Space Marine squad, regardless of who's firing the weapons. And basically, the orc boy that is closest to the squad of Space Marines will be the first one to die. Unfortunately, you have to remove the closest in Warhammer 40K 7th edition. This was a huge change between 5th edition and 6th edition, but it stayed the same in 7th edition. Now, a common situation that happens in Warhammer 40K 7th edition is that a target squad may be in different types of terrain at a moment. And when you fire at them, each one may receive a different cover save. For example, if you look at the terrain right here, the orc boys at the top of the screen are in ruins, so they would receive a 4+ cover save from the Space Marines firing at them. However, the ones in the middle here are completely out in the open. They're not in any terrain, and they're not obscured from line of sight from the people shooting at them, so they wouldn't receive any cover save. And finally, the ones at the bottom are in a crater, so they'd receive a 6+ cover save. So what you do is, you start with the model closest to the Space Marines firing at them to determine what kind of save does he get. If in the end he doesn't get any armor save, if the AP is better than his armor, if he doesn't get cover and he doesn't have an invul, he simply dies. Or has a wound removed from him as a result of the to wound rolls. And then what you do is you go through the wound pool, the number of dice that you result in the wound pool, and they are applied to the models. So you would apply the number of wounds to the squad, one at a time, equal to the wound pool that you choose. Now, if there are multiple wound pools, the person who's shooting the guns gets to choose which wound pool is allocated to the squad at a time. And what we typically do is you apply the wounds one at a time, going through the process. Does it get an armor save? Does it get a cover save? Does it get an invulnerable save? If so, roll the best one. If not, the model loses a wound. And any model that goes down to 0 wounds is removed from the game. So for this orc boy who has 1 wound, if he loses his wound, he is dead and is removed from the game. He is gone, not coming back. And once all this is done, so you've declared your target, you've chosen the weapon, you've rolled your hit rolls, you've rolled your to wound rolls, and then they've done their saving throws, you then either go on to the next weapon in that squad, or once all that is done, you then choose another squad in your army, and they can fire at a completely new target, which once again has to be in line of sight and in range. So now that we've covered all these in great detail, there's one more thing that you can actually do in the shooting phase, which is called running. Basically, instead of firing your guns, you can roll a run roll. So for most infantry, they get 1 dice. Most models, in fact, only get 1 dice in the run roll. And what typically happens is, you roll the dice, and they can move in the shooting phase rather than shooting their guns. They can move that amount of the dice in any direction that they want. However, if you run in the shooting phase, you cannot assault in the assault phase. That's just one of the rules. If you run in the shooting phase, you cannot assault in the assault phase. So now that we've covered the shooting phase in great detail, let's go over an example to tie this all together and to illustrate my points. So, this squad of Space Marines consisting of 4 Space Marines with bolters and 1 Space Marine with a plasma gun are firing at this squad of orc boys. So the first thing we do is declare who is shooting, the Space Marines, at who, the orc boys, and choose the weapon being fired first. In this case, we'll choose the bolt guns, because there are a lot of shots and we don't care about hitting a specific target. So first thing we do is figure out who is in range and who has line of sight to the orc boys. In this particular case, all of them have range and all of them have line of sight. Next, we figure out the number of shots based on the weapon profile. Since all of these Space Marines are rapid firing, they can fire 2 shots each, and so it's 4 bolters times 2 shots equals 8 dice being rolled. The ballistic skill of these Space Marines is 4, and as I mentioned, the dice plus their ballistic skill has to be equal to or greater than 7. So we roll the dice, and for every dice that is 3 and higher, since 3 plus 4 is 7, these dice result in a hit. The dice that are 1 and 2 do not result in a hit, since either of them plus 4 is not equal to or greater than 7. So we remove those dice from the hits. So now we have all the dice that resulted in a hit. Now we compare the strength of the gun, in this case 4, to the toughness value of the orc boys. In this case, also 4. And since they're equal, they need to roll a 4 or better on their dice to turn these hits into wounds. So you roll the dice equal to the number of hits on the boys, and for every dice that is 4 or greater, that results in a wound on the boys. Since there are no special rules that apply to these shots, they can all be put into a wound pool. So now we apply the wound pool to the orc boys. Now looking at the squad, the closest boy is out of cover. So unfortunately, let's go through the steps. Is the AP of the gun equal to or less than the orc boy? The AP of the gun is 5. The armor value of the boy is 6. 5 is lower than 6, therefore he does not get an armor save, unfortunately. Let's look at the orc boy's cover. He's unfortunately out in the open, so he doesn't get a cover save. And finally, does he have an invul save? No. That means that this orc boy will lose a wound as a result of the wound pool. So the very first dice is applied to him, and he goes down to 0 wounds because he only has 1 wound, and he's dead, and now removed from the table. The next closest boy is actually in cover. He is in ruins and gets a 4-up cover save. Does he get an armor save? No, for the same reasons as the previous boy. Does he have an invulnerable save? No, for the same reasons as the previous boy. So he actually has a 4-up 4-up cover save. So now we will roll at 1 dice at a time from the wound pool until this model is removed as a casualty from the game. So we roll the first dice from the wound pool. And he's okay, because we rolled a 4 or greater. But we roll the next one. Once again, he's okay, because he rolled a 4 or greater. On the third dice, however, he rolled less than 4. So that orc boy is dead. And then we would repeat this process for how many wounds are left in the pool to the boys in the squad. And then we choose the next closest target. Is he in cover? Does he get an armor save? Does he have an invulnerable save? If not, he gets a wound as a result of a single dice from the wound pool. And if he actually gets one of those, he rolls and see if he survives. And you keep going until the dice wound pool is depleted, or until the entire squad is destroyed, whichever one comes first. So, if these boys are shot at with tons of firepower and they end up dying, you just stop there because there's no one else to be shot at in this phase. However, when the dice pool is empty, that particular shooting is done, and then the squad can repeat this process using the plasma gun. Once again, he get 2 shots for rapid firing range. He needs 3 or better to hit, but the plasma gun is actually strength 7. So the strength 7 plasma gun only needs a 2 to wound, since it is 2 or more points higher strength than the opponent's toughness. So on any wound roll of 2 or higher results in a wound. And it's also AP2. So the value is definitely equal to or less than the orc's armor save, but the orc may receive a cover save depending on whoever's closest. And that's the shooting phase essentially in a nutshell. So just go over the points. You declare which one of your squads is firing. Always measure and determine line of sight before declaring this, because you don't want to be caught off guard when you realize that the squad you're shooting at is out of range or out of line of sight. All this stuff can be determined prior to your declaration. Once you've declared who's shooting, you declare who are they shooting at. You grab the number of dice equal to the number of shots. It depends on their weapon profile. You roll them. You add those dice to the ballistic skill of your shooters. Anything that results in a 7 or greater is a hit. 1s are automatically misses. You take all those dice equal to the number of hits from the shots. Roll them again. You compare the strength of your shots to the toughness value of your opponent's models and figure out what you need. Take all the dice that resulted in wounds, put them in a pool, and then apply them 1 dice at a time to the squad. Going through the process, do they get a cover save? Do they get an armor save? Do they have an invulnerable save? And once the dice are all depleted, that particular shooting phase for those guys is complete. And then you go on to the next gun in the squad, or you go on to the next squad in general. And that's the shooting phase in a nutshell. I really hope you enjoyed this video. It's by far the hardest phase to convey in this series, so I really hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a comment in the comment section down below of what you feel about this video, anything else you have to add, anything you want me to cover, and that way together we can teach all the new people how to play Warhammer 40K 7th edition. So thank you very much for watching. Until next time, this is Jay saying, happy painting everyone.